Hello and welcome to another episode of the Tyndale House podcast. We are now getting towards the end of our series on New Testament manuscripts, and I'm joined again by Nelson Shea and Dirk Jonkind, who are part of our New Testament team here at Tyndale House. Dirk is our academic vice principal. Nelson, I was sure I was going to get your job title right for this time. You are research associate for text and language.
Yeah, that's right.
Almost got it that time. And then we've got one more episode, I think, in the series to go. But we're in episode 7 of the series. We are primarily talking about the Tyndale House Greek New Testament. But we finished on a cliffhanger last time. And so I know there are very many people who have been feverishly waiting for this episode to come out to find out about this vast expansion in the amount of material that was available to textual critics that came about in the latter part of the 19th century. So it was an age of exploration and archaeology. People were digging up all sorts of things, finding stuff for the first time. So Nelson, tell us a little bit about how that changed the world for textual critics. What manuscripts were becoming available at that period, and how did that change things?
So there were a lot of important manuscripts that we talked about in an earlier episode about important manuscripts, which like Codex Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, I mean, they've been known for some time, but in terms of the readings being known by a wider group of people to where they could be accessed, not everyone can just go to the library that these manuscripts were held and just with free access look through the manuscript. So until a manuscript is really published with a transcription of it or even a facsimile edition, it's not really being widely studied or even used in the creation of a critical edition. But by the end of the 19th century and then getting into the 20th century, the major majuscules are getting published, transcribed, some facsimile editions. And so editors can start to use this material when they create new editions. But also, most importantly, with the discovery and the publication of papyri manuscripts, which are mainly valued because of their age, because they're quite a bit older than even those early majuscules, 4th century majuscules that we talked about. So some were known in the 19th century, but in terms of access to and transcriptions of, that really explodes in the early to mid 20th century. Yeah. And so you get obviously a rush to update or create new editions that take into account this early evidence in order to stay up with manuscript discoveries.
Yeah, okay, that's great. So we talked last time about how modern textual critics deal with differences between manuscripts and some of the variants and those kinds of things. And a lot of that discussion, I guess, was based on an awareness of these things, though we didn't actually talk about that vast expanse of material. Somebody who's particularly significant for the history of the Tyndale House Greek New Testament is Samuel Tregelles. So where does he fit in to what Nelson's just been describing, Dirk, and who was he?
So Tregelles is a 19th century British evangelical nonconformist background from Cornwall, the area there, or Devon, Cornwall, as his surname actually suggests. And he was a firm believer in what he called the plenary inspiration of Scripture, which means that every word of the Bible is important. But already when he was fairly young, in his 20s, he had noticed that in the manuscript of the book of Revelation, there is actually a lot of variety. And there's even more variety in Revelation than in the rest of the New Testament. So he asked himself the question, yes, okay, it's okay, I believe in plenary inspiration, but what are actually the words I believe in?
Yeah, right.
And so he set out that to reconstruct the text of the New Testament based on the actual evidence that there is. So being a nonconformist, he had intuitively less sympathy for established tradition, and much more for going back to the sources itself. So he set out, okay, let's start from the very beginning, and let us not be sort of subject or enslaved to what has happened over the last 3 centuries in the published text of the New Testament. Just let's start again.
And he felt that other people, like Westcott and Hort, was he contemporary with them? But certainly other people, they were too bound by tradition.
Westcott and Hort overlapped with Tregelles. And actually, when Tregelles died before he had finished his Greek New Testament, publishing it completely, it was actually Hort who finished it for him and made sure that that everything was done. I read somewhere, but I'm not completely sure if it is correct, that Westcott and Hort at some point actually delayed the publication of their Greek New Testament to wait till Tregelles had finished.
Okay.
But they were in close correspondence.
Okay, so it was other people he felt were being too traditional. Yeah, okay, right. So how is he in the background of the Tyndale House?
Well, because of Tregelles' emphasis on ancient documents and proven antiquity of readings, and because of his, at least kind of in evangelical conservative circles, sort of impeccable background, though, that there were no liberal tendencies in any of his writings. On the contrary, he was an arch-conservative. Yeah. So we thought, let's start with his text, update it lightly, and then sort of publish it so that we have a basis to comment on the most important variants of the New Testament. So the initial idea behind the Tyndale House Greek New Testament was to provide a vehicle for discussions of individual variants. Right. But very quickly it became clear that instead of a light touch revision, in light of all that material that was being published in the lifetime of Tregelles, but also afterwards and throughout the 20th century, it turned out to become quite a thoroughgoing, massive revision. But there are some traces of typical Tregelles still visible in the Tyndale House edition.
Right. So Tregelles was working when this new material was beginning to be discovered, or just before?
Yes, he was working when it was discovered. So he traveled around Europe as well, and he visited the Vatican, etc. But he had published Matthew and Mark already, so he published it in installments, his Greek New Testament, when Codex Sinaiticus was published for the first time. Right. And a few years later, Codex Vaticanus was published in facsimile for the first time. So it was a very exciting time for big manuscripts, and for some of it that came only after he had published a fascicle already.
Yeah. Okay. But there was, we said last time about the Nestle Aland, which has been the dominant Greek New Testament translation that scholars have used, or edition rather, not translation, the dominant edition that scholars have used. Why did you need to go back to Tregelles? Why did you need a new vehicle for talking about variants? Was the Nestle Aland not a suitable vehicle for discussing that in the first place?
Well, we believed certainly there was improvement possible. Also because we saw our task as editors as slightly different than what Nestle Aland has done over the decades. So in the Tyndale House Greek New Testament, we wanted to give the readers an experience that comes as close as possible to that which a reader would have when they were reading a Greek manuscript.
Right. In what ways?
In the layout of the page, in the way how we paragraph stuff. So if you open a Tyndale House edition, you notice that a paragraph is indicated by projecting the first letter of the line into the left margin, which is very typical for Greek manuscripts, but not really done in Western book printing.
Sure, we talked about that when we were talking about Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, didn't we? The outdenting rather than indenting. So yeah, it's nice that you've done those kinds of things. Yeah. You wrote an introduction to the Tyndale House Greek New Testament back in 2019, which it was setting out the approach and so on. And you talk about some of the unusual features. The paragraphing is one of those, isn't it? Other paragraphs, it's not just the layout of the paragraphs, but the paragraphs themselves are different from the Nestle Alarm.
Yes. What we try to do is to only have a paragraph in the Tyndale House edition where there is ancient evidence for a paragraph. And we tried to follow the majority of ancient evidence. Now, sometimes the ancient manuscripts differ widely amongst one another, and rather than have each of their paragraphs included, we selected. At other places, you get very surprising agreement between the manuscripts, and then we were very happy to include those as well.
Great. We'll talk more about paragraph divisions and chapter divisions with Nelson in our next episode. Yep, hold on to your excitement about that. A couple of other distinctive features that you mentioned in that book. How else is the Tyndale House Greek New Testament unusual or unique?
A surface feature which is different is that we are very happy to allow inconsistent spelling in our text, which is something that anyone who uses the Hebrew Old Testament is quite used to, where spelling is widely different. You can have full spelling, you can have defective spelling, etc. We allowed the evidence to determine that same thing to happen in the New Testament as well. Sometimes, of course, that is very annoying when you're used to find a certain word under a certain sort of letter in the dictionary. So there you have some adjustments to do. But at other times, it gives a real, very authentic feel to the text.
And what about the ordering of the text?
Yes, that's something that actually has become much more popular now than it was, say, 10, 15 years ago, is we have the Catholic epistles, so the letters of James, Peter, John, and Jude. Mm-hmm. We have them follow the book of Acts immediately. Because throughout the manuscript tradition, Acts and the Catholic epistles tend to form a group. Not universally so, but it is the strongest sort of grouping you see. And then that group is followed by the letters of Paul. Which interestingly then, you get the book of Acts as the introduction to all the letters. And the first half of the book of Acts is mainly about the other apostles. And the second half of Acts is about Paul. Right. And to see that then reflected in the letters that follow is a sort of neat feature.
Yeah, right. So that was found in early groupings of documents.
Yes, and throughout the Middle Ages as well.
So when did that change? Why are our Bibles, New Testaments now not in that order, so that we go from Acts into Romans and Paul's big letters?
Now, it is a very fascinating question, and I think the answer is that Erasmus decided for one or the other reason that this order should be preferred. And it's fun. I don't know why he chose it. It was an existing order in some Latin manuscripts, but it was definitely not the universal order up to the 15th century. But he decided, and since then, Reformation churches have all followed that order, and it is the order we have nowadays. But yeah, so if you use the Tyndale House edition, but some other Greek editions now as well, they will all reflect the better order.
Right. What does it mean that this is a critical edition?
Yeah, so a critical edition assumes that we don't have the original text of some author, in this case the New Testament authors, but it can be any classical author in any language. When you don't have the original writing of that author and you just have copies or manuscripts of that, then in order to try and recover that author's writings, you engage in textual criticism. And as a textual critic, what you produce ideally is a critical text. And what that means is that a critical edition or a critical text will basically mainly have two parts, right? You have the actual text that somebody will read, that you as the editor or editors have reconstructed, and then you'll have underneath that an apparatus where you will list the variations from the text that you have reconstructed, as well as the manuscripts that support your text and support the variations. So a critical edition is basically, if you don't have the original text of an author, which we don't have the original text of the New Testament, you have to reconstruct it. And then as a good editor, you need to provide the evidence for and against the text that you have reconstructed. So that's what the Tyndale House Greek New Testament is, and what other editions of the Greek New Testament do. They reconstruct the text and then provide the evidence for and against the text that they've reconstructed.
Right. So that takes us very much into the area of our last episode again, doesn't it? And the kind of how do we deal with all of those differences? So, in fact, we've done 3 episodes on that, how the Church Fathers handled differences in manuscripts, what the Reformers did, and then the more modern period. So how did you? Well, you weren't one of the editors. Dirk was one of the editors, and who else were the editors with you?
Oh, Pete Williams had a good input.
Yeah.
Patrick James, Peter had input.
Yeah, right.
There were others as well.
Yeah. So you've joined the project much more recently than that, of course, Nelson. But how did the editors make those kind of decisions? What was the process? What was distinctive about the way that the Tyndale House editors decided on these things? You've hinted at some of these things already, I guess.
Yes, well, I would like to hear Nelson's answer as well, because he wrote about the Tyndale House edition in his doctoral work.
We're going to come to that.
but at least our intention, our sort of starting point, is that we came to the realization that the copying process is just a normal cognitive psychological activity. You read, you remember, you write something down. And in the process of that copying, you make errors. Not intentionally, not deliberately, but simply it's part and parcel of the psychological activity.
As Nelson demonstrated with his exam, you were telling us in the last episode, yes.
You get distracted, etc. So we started with trying to explain a textual variant as the result of an error that happens during the normal copying process. Right. And once we have a satisfactory explanation, we are not going to try and find a more sophisticated reason. So the simple reason, if that suffices, that is okay. But when the simple reasons fail, then we need indeed to look at something more complicated, including even theological reasons or so. But they are, the higher type of reasoning is only a thing of last resort.
Right.
No, we don't start with it because there may be a much simpler, much down-to-earth explanation.
Okay. Can you give me a couple of examples? Maybe one of the simpler explanations and one of the more sophisticated.
Simple explanation is that you get a lot of influence from the immediate context. In the genealogy of Matthew, we get King David mentioned. And then we get in the next line David again mentioned as the one who actually produces a son, Solomon. And their later manuscript will repeat the word king with King David. Simply taken from a couple of words earlier, because there David was King David.
Yeah.
So it is that sort of thing that's part and parcel of the copying process, nothing nefarious going on. Things that may be more complicated is whenever we have the word to marry out in the Bible, in the New Testament. So now you can marry out your daughter, or you can give in marriage. It's often translated, which in Greek is the word gamidzo. Every times of the 6 or 7 times it occurs, we have a textual variant on it. And sometimes it is ek gamidzo, so really kind of expressing the out bit, or it becomes gamisko. But there's always a variant on that particular word, and it is consistent so throughout the New Testament. And there you start to think about, well, is there some editorial activity going on that has produced this sort of variation?
And what did you conclude?
Yes, it is, of course. I mean, it is an example I come up with because there was a conclusion here.
Okay. That's fair enough. So Nelson, your PhD. Now, Dirk isn't here. This is just between us. Your PhD was looking at the Tyndale House Greek New Testament and comparing it with the Nestle Aland, or with other editions. Was it just those two?
Just really those two, yeah.
And so you were exposing all the failures of the Tyndale House Greek New Testament and its successes as well, I imagine. So tell us about your dissertation. What were you trying to do, and what came out of that for you?
Yeah, so I mean, the edition was published in 2017, and yeah, you've basically had this maybe 30 or 40 year reign of the Nestle edition, sort of sitting as king at the top, and every scholar, pastor, student, with some exceptions, the Textus Receptus and the Byzantine text, would use that for commentaries, for sermon preparation, for papers in your exegesis classes. And so this new edition comes out. It's not a Byzantine, a majority, or Textus Receptus kind of text, because textual critics fought that battle sort of in the 70s and the 80s over that issue, and the majority text, Byzantine text guys, basically lost that battle, and Tyndale House was not trying to revive that with another sort of Byzantine majority Textus Receptus type thing.
Sorry, could you just give us a brief explanation again of Textus Receptus and Byzantine text, just for people who don't remember the previous episodes?
Yeah, so I mean, the Textus Receptus was basically the text that Erasmus created when he published the first Greek New Testament. It kept getting printed over and over and over with some slight modifications, but it's basically the Greek text that is behind the King James Version, and it's the Greek text that's he did the best that he could given his materials and his times, but it happened to be that he was using primarily later, compared to us today, later, a couple hundred years back then, that still feels pretty old, but when we have manuscripts now, over 1,000 years older than his, but he was primarily using later minuscule manuscripts, and that meant that in, maybe 5 or 6% of the text that he had longer stuff, like the long ending of Mark, like the pericope of the adulteress, and then just other long sort of added verses here and there. He had a different text than sort of the modern critical text that Nestle Tyndale House has. So this new Greek New Testament comes out. It's not a Byzantine text. It's not the Nestle text. So I had started using it. I liked it, but I still wondered how different is this to the Nestle-Aland text? Is it so close that it doesn't really make that much of a difference, or does it have some substantial differences? In 2019, I had met with Dirk at the Society of Biblical Literature meeting in San Diego, and I asked him, "Is there some list somewhere of differences between the two editions, so that I and others could get a sense of how different is this? You know, is it just a couple of tweaks here and there,
Right.
or are there some, significant textual differences between these two?" And he's, for obvious reasons, it's already so much work to produce an edition, so to do this sort of extra work, that I understood would take a lot of extra time. So there was no sort of list. So I decided, why not create this and take a look and figure out what the differences are. So in my dissertation, I did just go through the whole New Testament text and figure out that there's about 1,200 textual differences between the two editions.
Wow.
But what I also did was, 1,200. It's not like a massive amount, but it's not a tiny amount. Because for example, if you were to compare the Nestle-Aland with the Byzantine text, I think the number is somewhere like 6,000 differences.
Okay,
So there's even more. But when you get down into those, a lot of them end up kind of being, the word order is a little bit different. You add a conjunction, you remove a conjunction, you add a preposition, you remove a lot of them end up being sort of in that category to where, okay, yes, this matters in terms of the precise detailing of the text, but it doesn't make a huge difference in terms of interpretation or translation, or if you're teaching this text. So I narrowed it down in my dissertation that about 50 or so places where I thought the difference made a significant difference. So one example that stood out to me and to others as well is in the book of Ephesians, chapter 5, verse 22. In the Nestle-Aland text, so this is Paul talking to wives, and in the Nestle-Aland text, it literally just says wives to their husbands. So there's no verb. There's no verb for wives to submit to their husbands. That has to be implied from the context from the previous verse. Yeah. And you will get some people who basically say, "Hey, look, Paul never commanded wives to submit to their husbands. This is something that was added in the Byzantine text," because that is what you get in the Byzantine text. They added the imperative. And the Tyndale edition also has an imperative, although it's a third person imperative. So let wives be submissive to their husbands. And so that was a substantial difference, which actually makes a difference in sort of all these issues with gender and marriage and submission. That was a good example, I think, of a significant difference between the two editions.
Okay. So, did you come out with a clear front runner leader?
Well, what I tried to argue in the dissertation was not to say that one was better than the other. I was trying to say that these should complement one another, right? So the Tyndale house has some strengths and has some weaknesses. Nestle-Aland also has some strengths and some weaknesses, and they complement one another. They should both be used in scholarly work. Just like, if you're going to study, for a sermon or something, you probably would consult multiple translations, multiple commentaries, right? You wouldn't just read one commentator or just read one translation. You consult multiple resources to try and get the best picture that you can to study the text. So I basically said, yeah, there's strengths and weaknesses in both, and I think both need to be used by scholars rather than just using one.
Yep, great. And this is not the end of the road for the Tyndale House Greek New Testament. You're working on a second edition, so perhaps correcting the weaknesses that Nelson identified in his dissertation. I don't know. What's going on with that? What's the plan for the second edition?
So, as part of the kind of transparency, I've been working on a commentary where I explained the decisions that were made to create the text as it is.
What we were talking about just now.
That's right.
Yep. Right.
That commentary made sure that we went through the whole thing again. There were a few inconsistencies, etc. So that the text will be slightly cleaned up, I think. Then there is still a lot of fine-tuning to do on the actual punctuation and paragraphing, where with the benefit of spending another 4 or 5 years on it, we can refine that to a much better degree. Some of the places will remain fairly sort of think, okay, we made a choice here, and the choice should not be regarded as a very heavy choice, but there are other places where we think, gosh, there are remarkable coincidences here in the transmission. So punctuation and paragraphing is something that will be refined as well.
And when do we expect to see that published?
Oh, 2.5 years from now, give or take. Probably give more than take.
There's still quite a bit of work to do on that then. Yeah. And your textual commentary, where are things at with that?
We're in the final stages of the textual commentary at the time of speaking, sort of February 25. So it should see the light of day in 26.
Yep. Very good. Super. Thank you. It's good to talk about the Tyndale House Greek New Testament. Highly recommended to everybody, as long as they read some Greek. I mean, I have my edition here. If you're watching this on YouTube, you'll see that the pages are quite clean because I'm much better at Hebrew than I am at Greek, and I'm very glad that there's this edition with a dictionary in the back, which is that's the pages that I go to the most, I'm afraid. But it's great to have. Thank you very much for all your work on this, and thank you for this episode again. Please do join us again. We have one more episode coming with Nelson talking about divisions in the text, and I think we might see if we can sneak in an interview with Dirk to talk about his career as a textual critic and getting his DNA all over Codex Sinaiticus while he worked at the British Library. So we'll see if we can get that in as well at some point. But thanks very much for joining us. You know how it works, rate and review us, all those kinds of things. It really does help to let other people know about us. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.